Good morning. I thought it might be useful to provide a little bit of insight around why it is that the breath is the object of attention for so many mindfulness practices. And in doing so, I hope to provide a little bit of grist for the mill to think about of attention and awareness and why the breath can be so helpful. And if not the breath, then there's other parts of the body, for example, that could be the object of attention that would serve a similar role. So, we direct our attention to the sensations of the breath. By now, this is very familiar to you, with the intention to stay there. And when the mind wanders and we realize it, to bring our attention back. It's like we're dropping anchor. We're a boat, this body. We drop anchor on the breath, an area underneath the sea, for purposes of staying put, for remaining somewhat steady. And then when the boat begins to drift, as the mind begins to drift, at some point there's a tug, the tug of the rope. That serves two purposes. One, it keeps us close to where we've dropped anchor. And it also wakes us up so we realize that we've wandered. This is important to reflect on, to understand from your own direct experience. The imagery of a boat and a rope and an anchor might be somewhat useful. You know this and can know this from your own direct experience. You can feel it. You can experience each of those elements. Now, importantly, we don't just drop anchor anywhere, do we? We look for a place that is even, or whatever other conditions we might, for the right place to drop anchor. And so in this case, we're dropping anchor essentially with the breath. Why? Well, the breath is a relatively steady, neutral place to rest our attention, right? And you know this and can know this by doing a practice where you, in fact, now you might want to do this. Be careful with where you choose for the second place we're going to drop anchor. But you can rest your attention, lower or close your eyes, resting attention on the sensations of the breath. And especially if you've been practicing this relatively quickly, you're there in a slightly steadier state than you might have been a few moments ago. And there can be something compelling, reinforcing about being here with this breath. We've dropped anchor, and there's a steadiness that comes from the skillful use of our attention and our intention. Now you could also think about something that didn't go so well, a circumstance at work or school or with somebody in a relationship, and nothing too tumultuous, but you could rest your attention there. You could drop anchor there. Now, there's practices where that is exactly what we do. And of course, in life, that's exactly what happens again and again. But if you were to, in fact, if you'd like to, lower or close the eyes and bring to mind a memory of something that didn't go so well, or turn to a future possibility that is of concern. And if you're attending and keeping your attention there, you probably find it to be a little bit more agitating. It's like the boat has dropped anchor in a place that's not such a steady place. Maybe it's slippery and it drags. The boat's more likely to move further afield, or it just is an unsteady place for that anchor to be. And so that is an expression of where the mind is at any given moment. And of course, life is filled with the mind being somewhere at every given moment. But we do these practices to create a learning opportunity for the nature of the mind, and also to anchor ourselves in a steadier place. And now this brings us to one more piece, and that is the breath and what it means to sort of anchor our attention around an object like the breath. And this gets into some of the effortfulness that we sometimes can experience. So I'm going to pick a slightly different metaphor to try to help make this point Please pardon the shifting of metaphors, but it's keeping close to the original in some ways. If you were fishing and you were to sort of let the line out, you'd be sort of dropping that hook somewhere deliberately. That would be sort of akin to resting your attention, directing your attention somewhere. Once the line is out, then you've already done the directing. Now you wait. You can't sort of force the hook to stay where you've directed it. It's going to perhaps eventually make its way back and you'll do it again, or whatever it is that prompts somebody to send the line out. But the point is, once you make that effortful sort of directing of attention, the directing of the line of the fishing pole, it's done. And in many ways, what really is happening when we direct our attention to the breath is once we do so, we've sort of dropped the line. We're done. There's no more effortful focusing, directing of attention because we're already there. Now what happens is we have the opportunity to be there, which is to be aware of where we are. And maybe the center point of where we are temporarily is the breath, because that's where we directed our attention. But in doing so, we then become aware of our experience. Now, when our attention is really trapped and captured by something, our awareness more broadly of our experience shrivels and shrinks around the thing that we are attending to. And so, yes, it begins by saying, let me pay attention to my breath. Let me notice the sensations of my breath. Let me really become granular. And that's intending to sort of drop that firm, steady anchor in a very reliably useful place. But within a few moments, that attention will soften. And to the extent that we've practiced and have reinforced the ability to have a steadier state of mind, we will stay in proximity with an awareness of our experience. We could say in the periphery, but really we're aware, and the directing of our attention helped us locate a steady state to then be aware. Of course, as the mind wanders and our attention gets lost in other places, that quality of awareness diminishes. It's almost an inverse relationship that you can feel when attention is really nowhere in particular, but you're alert. There's awareness of sights and sounds and tastes and smells and thoughts and feelings, etc. When you become captured by something that your mind is attending to, so to speak, that awareness of the larger field just sort of collapses in many ways around the thing that you're paying attention to. If what you're paying attention to, you know you're paying attention to, it's deliberate, it's intentional, then even though awareness is somewhat compromised, there's nonetheless a very vigilant, alert state that can be useful. And in fact, if you're really penetrating into understanding what's going on with something you're reading or what somebody's saying, you would expect that there would be this sort of concentration of energy in that direction and less of a perceptual knowing of everything else that's going around. That's a useful narrowing of tension and an attenuation of the larger field of awareness. That's effective and skillful, especially because it's deliberate and intentional. Of course, when the mind just gets pulled away by something, well, then you've almost lost both. The awareness of your experience collapses, and you don't even know where you are because you're lost in thought. And so that you can know by sitting and paying attention to an object and observing what happens in that larger knowing of experience. it's very directly ascertainable, and that level of understanding will grow in time, but you don't have to wait long to have it. But going back to what I began with a few moments ago, as it relates to dropping that line on, for example, the breath, and then not needing to force attention there, it's very similar. And there's therefore no need to be trying hard. We direct our attention to the breath. We rest our attention with the breath because that happens quite naturally once attention is there. And then as the line sort of pulls and we're no longer there, we might recast our attention. That's that redirect your attention to the breath. The key that I wish to share with you is once you direct your attention to the breath, relax. You'll know what to do when you find yourself lost in thought, but relax. You've done your bit. You've taken this extraordinary capacity that you have to direct your attention somewhere, and the rest follows. And it's a practice. I'll close with one more thing because there's a lot of little nuggets in here for you. And if you find one that you take away from this, that would be very useful. The last piece is this. Why attend to the breath? Well, we sometimes talk about the fact that we can take several slower, deeper, fuller breaths to deliberately feel more relaxed. That's not necessarily a mindfulness practice, that's a relaxation practice, which draws upon a shift in our nervous system arousal from a more fight, flight, freeze state to a more relaxed state. And we can manufacture that deliberately, almost at will, whenever we want, by slowing down the breath. It's a useful thing to do for no particular reason, to get in the habit of it. Plus, even if we think it's no particular reason, we're probably wound up a little bit. So it's like pressing the reset button. And it can be useful, especially when we realize we're caught up in something. And even that realizing we're caught up in something is its own gradient. It's not like we're caught up in something and then we realize it. We're somewhere in the getting caught up process. And at some point we realize it. And the sooner we realize it, of course, the better in many ways. And when we do realize it, we could bring a few slower, deeper breaths to that experience. So we've talked about the fact that while you can take a few slower, deeper breaths, in fact, let's take one as we breathe in and out. Maybe one more. And out. There is this shift that we can notice, that we can be aware of. Now, what we just did, you could have done looking at me and listening to me and really largely unaware of what you were in fact doing. You can also take another breath now, very aware of the sensations of the breath. You probably did this before a little bit, but you could do this even more. So let's take another breath, very aware of the sensations of the breath. And I'll leave it to you to breathe in and out on your own. Now, there we brought together a slower, more deliberate breath with an awareness of the sensations of the breath. We could say relaxation, mindfulness, concentration coming together. Well, when we rest our attention on the breath as the mindfulness practice for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, something really extraordinary is happening. We are dropping anchor in a reliable vehicle, place, object for cultivating a steadier, more relaxed state. And when we notice that we've wandered away, well, we're already at the place with the breath that can be useful for creating a more deliberately creating a more steady state. The two are sort of there hovering. So perhaps you notice your mind wandering, you take a breath, you return, and you're already at the place where the breath as a relaxation practice and the breath as the object of attention are working together, which can be very useful. So, to break this down and to close with this, when you're resting your attention on the breath, you've aimed your attention to the sensations of the breath and you're there. Let it be what it will be. Your attention will hover and will meander. Sometimes it'll meander to something that's relatively benign and innocuous. You'll realize it, and with really hardly a shift in the breath or in the agitation of the body, you'll be back with the breath because you noticed, you felt the little tug of having wandered away from where you dropped anchor. Sometimes you will feel a more agitatedness because of where the mind goes as you drift from that place. And in doing so, because you're already with the intention to be with the breath as the object of attention, you will naturally find that you'll draw upon the breath many times in ways that's imperceptible, but you could also do it deliberately to settle back in to the breath. It's like you're redirecting the anchor of your attention to the breath, and it's like you're really doing it with an intentional and a skillful, more fully returning to this body, to this present moment, led by, guided by the breath. All right, I hope you found this exploration of many little pieces of what mindfulness practice is and the utility of the breath as one potential object. You could certainly replace an aspect of the body with the breath if you prefer, or even sounds. There's other ways that, or there's other objects of attention that can serve a very similar role for which the metaphors are just as apt. And so I hope you have found this to be helpful.